later, and that's why my memories were as fresh to mention about.
Okay, mention that what you just mentioned again, where you talked about why you remembered these things so well.
Was that? Oh, did I mention that earlier? I don't know that I did.
I don't think that you did. So let's just cover it right now because we're rolling.
Okay. Yes. One of the reasons, but then I remember so well the things I told you about the questions we were asked and the points that Ms. Ransom tried to get across about how we should behave ourselves. One reason I remember is because just 2 years after I experienced all of these things, when I was expecting my first child, awaiting the birth of my first child, I was aware that I had witnessed another birth. I had been a witness to the birth of the atomic age, and I wanted to write all of this down so this child that I was going to be having would know about what it was like to come to Oak Ridge and to I titled the first part of this, A Boy, A Girl, A Bomb. That was the first part of this book. When A Boy and A Girl, we called people's girls and boys back then, we were pretty young, to work on the A Bomb. So that's one reason that my recollections are as clear as they are.
Good, thank you. How much emphasis, we're going to get back onto some health questions. I've got categories that I'm going through.
Health questions, okay.
So we're just kind of, I know it seems like we're kind of jumping around here, but how much emphasis does the company and your supervisors place on safety? And was your health regularly monitored while you were there at the facility?
Not to my knowledge. We had badges. As far as I know, my health was not regularly monitored. I don't remember having to go to medical. I don't remember. Later on, once in a while, I know this. When I worked at ORNL, my badge showed some radiation many years later. And that was caught because they did monitor badges, and mine had radiation. The reason the radiation was in my badge was I had received an x-ray from my family doctor who lived in Knoxville, and my badge was in my purse on the other side of the room. But it showed that the radiation I'd been close to radiation. So that must have been an awful lot of I don't know the correct term, whether radiation scattering or what, but the badge in my purse on the other side of the room showed too much of an exposure. That's the only time I was ever aware of anything to do with radiation.
That's why those X-ray techs stand behind that concrete wall.
Yeah,
lead. Be safe, and then they get behind this wall.
Right.
Were you ever hurt or injured while working at K-25?
No.
Okay. Let's talk about the Manhattan Project a little bit. And let me just restate this question, even though you kind of answered it before. And what was your understanding of the function of the K-25 facility during World War II, or while you were there?
All I knew was I really didn't understand what was going on. I didn't know it all. I just knew the overall object of trying to make an atom bomb. And that's all I knew. I knew nothing at all about the process, nothing that was going on. My husband never discussed classified information with me, never. I didn't even know, I had no idea what he did.
Okay. So really, you didn't even know at that point that they were enriching uranium-235
No.
or anything like that?
No, I didn't know that. He didn't tell me that. I did not know they were enriching. No, I didn't know about the separation of isotopes, anything like that until much later, when it wasn't a secret anymore.
Okay. How did you've kind of answered this before, but let me restate the question again. And as how did you link what you were doing with what was going on with the war effort, with the current events and the dropping of the atomic bomb on August 6th?
How did I link it when I was working there?
Yeah.
I didn't. I knew other people were working at other plants because at Cove Lake, where I lived with these other GI couples, one couple named Lesh, they drove their car. They had a car. They were one of the only couples that had a car. They drove their car to X10. So they worked at X10. I didn't know about really if anybody worked at Y12 or anything about Y12. Maybe I knew it existed, but I didn't know that there was an X10 and K25, and I don't remember having heard about Y12 back then. I might have, but I don't remember.
Okay, and when you saw, you mentioned that one time where your husband pointed at the newspaper and they were
Yes.
talking about atomic bombs. Did you see other current events going on in newspapers, and did you link them to the work that you were doing?
No, nothing. That was the only inkling. No, nothing. Nothing at all.
Okay. What was your reaction to the August 6, 1945 news and the role of the K-25 facility in the Manhattan Project?
Well, as I said, the reaction in our office was one of exhilaration and euphoria and celebration and all that kind of thing. And my family knew what I was doing. That was something else, too. We got letters from the family all about that. They were really excited to know what Joanne was doing in Oak Ridge. Of course, all I did was clerical work, but they knew why Oak Ridge existed then.
And so that was kind of like I guess, kind of cathartic to you in a way that your family and
Yes.
people actually knew, kind of what was going on.
Yeah, it made me feel important in my hometown that I was working, even though my job couldn't have been any more lowly than it was, to know that I was connected in any way at all with this development.
Okay. If you could relive those years in Oak Ridge during the war, would you change anything?
I don't know how I could. I wasn't really happy about living in Oak Ridge. Well, of course, I didn't live in Oak Ridge, but shortly after we came to actually live in Oak Ridge, when my husband was still working at K-25 and in the Army, he worked 10 years at K-25, as I think I said, he was still in uniform when we moved into Oak Ridge, into a Victory Cottage. Still in the Army, still working on the project. In fact, he continued to work at the K-25 plant for the next 10 years. And I was very pleased about living in Oak Ridge then. Then I got a feel for the town itself, and that's when I gradually fell in love with Oak Ridge.
Okay. How do you think that history will view the Manhattan Project and its outcome?
It's hard to say. I know that the words haunt me of Richard Rovia, who wrote The Making of the Atomic Bomb, that humankind has devised the means of its own destruction. So that would be one way to view it. But there are other more positive ways to view it. That people, our country, there were many lives saved. I know my husband, my present husband, my first husband died. My present husband had a first cousin who was in the infantry, and he was getting ready to go invade Japan. He was very happy about the lives saved, as many people were. People didn't have to go and invade Japan, and some people feel that it even saved the lives of the Japanese, because so many more people would have been killed, their lives and our lives, had we not had an atom bomb. So that's another view.
Okay. Let's see. You weren't here for the expansion program period, really. You had left the K-25 facility, and then you come back at some point later. And let me go ahead and just cue you for that now. And let's talk about you worked out here at Oak Ridge and K-25, and you left for a while, and then you came back, and you want to talk a little bit about different perspectives that you have. Do you want to let's talk
Yes.
a little bit about that this time?
Yes, I would like to do that. After I worked at K-25, and after I came back and we lived in a Victory Cottage, which is a story in itself, I can tell you about that, which I will in a little bit, but you wanted to ask about working in Oak Ridge and other perspectives. I didn't go back to work. I had 3 children, and I decided I wanted to go back to school and get my degree when my children were all in school. When my youngest was in the 6th, 7th grade, I wanted to go back to school and get my bachelor's degree. So I did, and that was a good thing I did, because I couldn't have gotten another job. When my husband died, my first husband, I was only 40 years old, and I had to make a living. So I was able to get a job at Oak Ridge National Laboratory, and I found it very ironic what I was doing at Oak Ridge National Laboratory. I was a member of the Civil Defense Research Project that had been established by Eugene Wigner, who was a Nobel Prize winner. And he had started the project, and he came still. Jim Brazee then ran it, but Eugene Wigner came back 1 week a month to work with us and see how things were going. But the purpose of that project was to devise means of defending our country against the very bomb that I had, in a very lowly way, worked on at K-25, how to protect our country against nuclear warfare, and also chemical warfare, biological warfare. And it amazes me to this day that the variety of things that they were working on. In fact, I just wonder if there's a group somewhere working secretly on those same things today. I don't know, of course. But one of the men in our group then, and none of this that I'm telling you was classified, what he was working on, I mean, now it isn't, was working on biological warfare agents, what to do to protect us against poisonous gases and biological warfare agents such as anthrax, smallpox, sound familiar? Botulism, which didn't, equine encephalitis, which I don't even hear about today. But these were some of the things, how would we protect ourselves against them? And we had a physicist working on underground blast shelters with something called baffles. There were structures from the ceiling of the underground shelters that would attenuate, lessen the shock waves from a blast. We had someone working on that, how to attenuate shock waves from a blast. We had a doctor of veterinary medicine who was studying the effects of radiation on farm animals and also how to decontaminate the meat if the animals should be irradiated. And I guess one of our most, one specialist who was probably the most specialized of specialists was an apiologist, whatever. It was bees. He studied bees and whether they were, how subject they were to radiation. They were very resistant to radiation, but he was doing this because bees were important to pollinate the fruit trees on the West Coast. That's why he was looking at bees. We had a do-it-yourself kind of guy, Crescent Carney, who was a brilliant man, and he studied how to quickly erect fallout shelters and things that anybody could do in case of we needed to do something like that, and how to make homemade dosimeters so we could measure radiation. Those are just some of the different things that people did.
Good. Let's see, and you already, I guess, just restate exactly what it was that you did as far as your job title. What kind of job did you do at K25?
Well, my job title was just clerical worker, low level. I think it was third-class clerk. I don't think there was anything lower than that in the clerical area.
Okay, well, what do you feel was your most challenging assignment that you had to do while working there?
K25?
Mm-hmm.
Survive.
That's it, huh?
Yeah.
Okay. Is there a significant accomplishment, or what was your most significant accomplishment that you accomplished while you were there?
At K25?
Mm-hmm.
Well, I held the job. I stuck to it. I did it. Even though I had a cough all summer, I came to work every day. I don't think I took any vacation. I guess survive would be it.
Good, real good. Here, this is one I wanted to ask you. Was there any conflicts that occurred between management, co-workers, and the unions?
At K25?
Mm-hmm.
Not that I was aware of at K25.
Okay. But what about as far as would that be like the whole K25 site?
I probably would not have been aware of conflicts if they did have them, but I was not aware of any conflicts.
Okay.
As far as I could see, people got along harmoniously.
Okay. Let's talk about women a little bit. Being that you're a woman yourself, you probably have some pretty good perspectives on that. What sorts of roles did women have working at K25, and how were they treated?
Women, well, the ones that were in most abundance, of course, that I saw, most visible, were the clerical workers in the offices. All offices seem to have clerical workers like me and like the secretary of our group. And then the women who were operators, the ones who were around the panels, operating the dials and whatnot along the panels. Now, there was some nurses there. One of the women at Cove Lake, whose GI husband came with her and my husband and me to work, was in the laboratory. She analyzed samples. So that was more of a technician's job, and the laboratory was where she worked was air-conditioned. So she had a much more posh, pleasant job than those of us who had to work in that hot U building.
What was it like for you being a woman working at K25?
It wasn't, I guess it would be almost like a woman in a clerical job anywhere else in a man's world, you know.
Okay. And you mentioned a little bit about dress code. Did everyone have a dress code to adhere to?
Well, Miss Ransom said not to wear, that was the only dress code that I knew of. The men did not dress they were not very well dressed, as I say. They just wore anything they wanted to. Now, my husband was a GI. And they had something they wore called fatigues when they were at work. They didn't have their uniforms, but that's another story. There were a lot of GIs out there, people who were in the special engineering detachment, as was my husband. Now, since they lived off base, he didn't live in the barracks. Every third day, he would have to check in. So the bus that we rode, which had a number of GIs on it who worked at Cove Lake and at some of the outlying areas like La Follette and besides Caryville, Jacksboro, Clinton, the bus would have to stop by the barracks so all the GIs could go check in and register. Now, they was not supposed to wear their fatigues off the area. The fatigues they could wear at work, but when they left the plant, they were supposed to wear their uniforms. Well, one time my husband didn't have time to put his uniform on, and he left with his fatigues on. And he was stopped at the gate and taken off by the guards. And I was really worried about him. He didn't get home till the last bus at 9:30 that night, because I had heard that the punishment for doing things like that was to dig a 6x6 hole, senseless punishment. And it didn't happen. He didn't have to do that. But I was mighty worried, and never again did he wear his fatigues off. They were very strict with the GIs, but that wasn't K-25. That was the Army.
Huh. Was it ever established that people had to dig a 6x6 hole, or was that just kind of?
It might have been a rumor. People, the guys said that they were occupying Oak Ridge. That's what the Special Engineering Detachment said. The guys at K-25 would say, well, we're occupying Oak Ridge, and it's a lot nicer to occupy Oak Ridge than it is to be sent overseas. But that was always a threat. If GIs should fight or do anything like that, there was always a threat. Well, we might be sent overseas if you do things like that. So they stayed pretty much in line. Very few altercations.
Okay. Let's see. As a woman at K-25, I mean, were you treated respectfully by your male coworkers?
Oh yeah. They
Were you treated any differently, or?
They were very nice. The whole office had a very congenial, friendly air. Everybody was first name, first name basis, informal.
Okay. And your social life at work, what was that like?
There wasn't really much social life at work. We were working too hard to have a social life, but they did have things we could do in Oak Ridge. We worked, as I said, 6 days a week, but occasionally we'd stay in and see a movie and take the last bus to Cove Lake. And then there were dances at the recreation halls, and my husband and I and some other Oak Ridgers would go to these dances. The GIs got in free, but the civilians, the men who were civilians and the women, they had to pay. And when you paid, they would have a rubber stamp that they'd put on your wrist, paid, for the women and the ones who were not in the service, and you remained paid for about a week. You couldn't get that stuff off no matter how much you washed. So that's what you had to do to have a little recreation at the dances.
Let's talk a little bit about minorities over
Yes.
Oak Ridge, and we talked a little bit about them out in the living room. Did you have any contact with African Americans and other minorities?
The only minorities that worked at the plants that I was aware of were the maids and sometimes the janitors. Minorities were not well treated in Oak Ridge. They were separate facilities. Minorities lived in something called hutments. They separated the men from the women. And if a woman got pregnant, she was sent off the area in a bus. The treatment was very, very bad. This was the South, and the treatment was, I'd use the word abominable, very, very bad.
Okay,
Of course, that changed.
Did you see that change evolve? I mean, during the whole period of time that you lived and worked here?
Oh, indeed. It was a segregated community for a long time with Jim Crow laws, but the Oak Ridge schools were one of the first to become integrated. When the Clinton High School had this incident where the bomb was set in the high school because of integration, the Oak Ridge people let one of the schools that wasn't being used to be used for the people in Clinton from that high school. And of course, later on, when I became involved in affirmative action, I became, first of all, the affirmative action coordinator of Oak Ridge National Laboratory, and things had changed. There were executive orders that had teeth in them. We were a government installation, as was K-25. All 4 of the installations were called GOCOs, government-owned, company-operated. And Union Carbide ran, I guess, all of them when I was connected with the nuclear division. And we had to have an affirmative action plan written every year with goals and timetables to hire and promote qualified minorities and women into the job openings that were available. And these laws had teeth in them. We had compliance reviews that were conducted at our installations, all of them, K-25, ORNL, every one of them, to make sure that we were complying with these laws, that we were indeed recruiting and hiring and promoting minorities and women. Not that it happened very fast, but yes, it did happen, and things changed a great deal.
Good. Let's talk a little bit about, I guess, married life in Oak Ridge and being K-25, and what was life like for your spouse? And did you have children? I forgot to ask.
Not when I worked. Yes, I had 3 children in Oak Ridge when I lived in Oak Ridge. Life in Oak Ridge was very, very pleasant. There were all kind of clubs for people. There was a women's club. You could go to various sections of it, the history section, the book section, the bridge section, the garden section. And I joined the women's club early on when I lived in a Victory Cottage. So there was, and my husband and I went horseback riding, and we hiked, and we made a lot of friends in Oak Ridge. When we first lived in a Victory Cottage, and in fact, wherever we lived, Bart, our neighbors became our friends. People who came to Oak Ridge, few of us had any relatives here. We depended on one another. And as I mentioned earlier, things were in short supply. Things were rationed. And when we lived in the Victory Cottage, we were always borrowing from one another. And we got to be, as I say, dependent on one another. If somebody was sick, somebody else would come take care of them. And very, very friendly community. It was also a community to work. You could make friends easily because we were all new here. It was easy to make friends, good social life. We were friendly with our neighbors. We met people in various clubs and groups, and it was easy to have a lot of friends in Oak Ridge. And people helped one another out a great deal. Later on, when we went a semester, a more permanent type house when we could rent. When our children were born, we lived on that. And in a semester, our neighborhood had a nursery group. 5 mothers right in the neighborhood who had children the same age, preschool children, would take turns. One each day would have all 5 children at her house all morning and have supervised play for the children. People banded together, babysitting clubs and nursery groups. And we were friendly with our neighbors. We played bridge with them. We got to know them. Our neighbors became our family in a way.
You must have dreaded those days when it was your turn to do the nanny group and have all 5 kids.
Well, my mother dreaded it worse. She came one day to take care of the kids when I was about to have my 3rd child, and she found it very tiring.
Let's see. A lot of these questions you already answered, but you showed me some pictures and stuff of the Victory houses. But for those that haven't seen your picture, why don't you describe what?
Well, a Victory Cottage. Well, that was the first place my husband Ralph and I lived in on the area. It was very flimsy. It was a 2-family unit, and the floor was the walls were so thin we could hear the neighbors. Our neighbors were from Virginia, the couple who lived in the other one, and they were ootin' to boot the hoose all day long with their Virginian accent, and the floors were flimsy. One day when I had on high heels, my heel ran through the floor. So I called the Rona Anderson people. They were the fix-it people. When anything went wrong in Oak Ridge, no matter what kind of house you lived in, Rona Anderson guys would come fix it early on. So they came and they put a little tin plate on the floor where my heel had gone through. Well, in the Victory Cottage, it was heated by an oil stove. And the oil stove heated the house, heated the water, and you cooked on it. And when you cooked, it didn't cook very well. When you baked, you just put something in and prayed. You couldn't regulate the oven at all. And it was fine in the winter. We moved into our Victory Cottage in February 1946. It was cold, so the Victory Cottage was nice and warm. Then summer came, and it was hot. So we had to turn off the oil stove so we wouldn't burn up, cook on a hot plate. We couldn't even get a hot plate. We had to get just the unit that fits into a hot plate to boil things in, and we had to take cold showers. Then the windows wouldn't open. So what do? You walk several blocks to the half a mile to Grove Center because you don't have a telephone. And you call Rona Anderson. Then you wait for them to come. 2 men came, and they opened the windows for me. They were on little wooden pegs, hard to open. They had a hard time, but they opened them. Okay, fine. It was a cooler. A week later, it starts to rain. So what do? You go back to Grove Center. You call Rona Anderson. They come back. I happen to get the same 2 men. They said, this is the truth. Lady, make up your mind. You want these windows opened or closed? Fine choice. So it was primitive. The ice box, too. I didn't know about ice boxes. When I was 5 years old, we got a refrigerator. Frigidaire, we called it when I was a child. So ice boxes, I didn't know about ice boxes. Well, they don't keep food cold very long. One day they had a bargain. They had lamb chops, actually, at the grocery store, and I bought enough for 3 nights, and they spoiled. You also were dependent on the Iceman to come. You had to put a sign out, whether you wanted 20 pounds or 40 pounds, and you put that in front of your house with whichever you wanted side up so they could see, and the Iceman would come put the ice in the ice box. But you had to be home. And then the oil man would come fill the oil stove several times a week, and you needed to be, I don't remember whether you needed to be home for that, but you did need to be home for the Iceman, unless a neighbor would take care of it for you, but they often did. So those were very primitive dwellings.
So were they lacking in electricity altogether? Or?
Oh, no. We had lights.
I guess it had to do with trying to conserve electricity in the area because you're 5 years old and you had a refrigerator. And
Well, that's when I was a child, yeah.
Right, and then you get to be 20 years old and then you have to go back to an ice box and an oil stove.
I don't really know why it was so primitive. Telephones, only the people who were the big shots had telephones. We know telephones. And when we got to live at a flat top, we had a party line. You couldn't get a private line very easily either. That was another thing.
Okay. Let's see, what else do we have here? Okay. Let's talk a little bit about living in Oak Ridge. We wanted to get to living in Oak Ridge, and you've talked a little bit about that. And any of these topics that you want to talk about, and this is like, where did you live? What were your living conditions, right? You can talk about the secret city and your experience there. You want to talk about how it was fenced and secured, or could you leave Oak Ridge?
Oh, yeah.
Stuff?
You could leave and return freely. That was no problem.
Okay, let's talk a little bit about that. So we had the secret city, but you're able to leave and come back?
And we were able to have guests. We were able to have guests before people knew what Oak Ridge was. Before it was an open city. You know, where they still had gates. You could get people to come. You could have your family come see you.
Okay. Let's see. Was there positive aspects of living in Oak Ridge? And the bad conditions.
It was a wonderful place to live. I don't know if I told you this now or earlier, but it was a place where people in their 20s and 30s could be on the boards of organizations. It was really great. I was on the board of I was on the Girl Scout Council, the board of the Oak Ridge League of Women Voters. All of us, not just me, I'm not just talking about myself, we were all being able to be involved in community activities and be heading these things that our parents did when they were in their 50s, 40s, no one in their 20s and 30s did things like that. So it was a really wonderful community. We could make it the kind of town we wanted it to be. We had a symphony orchestra. Our symphony orchestra in Oak Ridge is the longest continuous symphony orchestra in the state of Tennessee. And it started out with Oak Ridgers who wanted to get together to play music on a voluntary basis. We had early on, as early as 47, when I wrote Oak Ridge and Me, my book. As early as that, we had a playhouse that gave wonderful plays, all put on by the people who lived here. The same with the symphony orchestra, all volunteers. And a club for any interest you could think of. Hiking clubs, tennis clubs, bridge clubs, book clubs, you name it, they had one. It was a cultural community. It was a community that was quite cosmopolitan. People came from all over. And I don't think it could have found a better place to live. It wasn't a snobbish community. The one thing that was hard to do is keep up with the Joneses, not from the standpoint of wealth, but were you doing enough volunteer work? People were supposed to be doing good, and I think that still is true. People in Oak Ridge spend a lot of time helping other people. The neighborliness started, because we were a town of strangers. That whole way of life continued on. I know my husband and when my present husband and I lived off the area for a while, and our house burned down. We came back to live in Oak Ridge. We came to a neighborhood where I didn't know anybody, a subdivision. I didn't know anybody, a part of town that didn't even exist when I had lived in Oak Ridge earlier. The neighbors came around. They brought cupcakes. They brought tomatoes.
Oh, we got 1 minute left. So, how you doing? You want to take a break real quick? Because I got a few more questions we need to go over.
Well, they're just a few. We can finish.
Yeah. Okay. Well,